Massey, and on behalf of the entire YWCA St. Paul team, I'd like to welcome you to the first in our series of equity and justice conversations. Each conversation will focus on a specific topic that allows us to explore the impact of systemic racism and racial disparities in our community. We'll also talk about the actions we can take to address the challenges we face and make a meaningful impact. Today, we're discussing homelessness and housing disparities. I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Yohuru Williams, a YWCA St. Paul board member and also a distinguished university chair, professor, and founding director of the Racial Justice Institute at the University of St. Thomas. Yohuru will provide some context and background, and then we will all have an opportunity to engage in this important discussion. We'll break into small groups, virtual meeting rooms, so that we can exchange ideas and discuss how to take intentional actions towards solutions. Throughout our conversation this afternoon, the Zoom chat will be available for your questions and comments. Each breakout group will have a YWCA St. Paul staff person to facilitate the 20-minute discussion. YWCA St. Paul provides safe, affordable, supportive housing to homeless families and individuals through 5 sites of owned housing and by working with community landlords. And we help these families and individuals achieve the stability they need to thrive. The YW staff facilitating the group discussions are familiar with the problem of homelessness and the issues of housing instability. After the small group discussions, we'll all rejoin this virtual gathering space to share insight from those conversations. So right now, I'd like to turn to Yohuru to get us started. Yohuru?
Thanks, Gaye. How's everybody doing this evening?
Good.
That's good. And I'm going to share my screen to get us started. So tonight, we just want to give you a bit of context, and Gaye and I will be sharing a broad overview of the issue of homelessness and housing in Minnesota, but also in a larger context as well. And I want to begin this evening by offering some conventional wisdom from Robert Kennedy, who in 1968 said, "Only those who dare to fail greatly can achieve greatly. Progress is a nice word, but change is a motivator, and change has its enemies. Tragedy is a tool for the living to gain wisdom, not a guide by which we live." We are living in an extraordinary moment at the present when we think about the last 5 months in the United States, from COVID-19 to the tragic murder of George Floyd. And it is reacquainting, in some cases, people with some longstanding issues around racial equity and justice, the most significant of which, at least nationally, the one that's gained the most attention is around police brutality. But the reality is that if we understand that in a broader context, housing is a principal part of that conversation. Having said that, when we think about what Robert Kennedy shared in 1968 and how it connects to this moment, it's important for us to note, as Gaye Adams Massey does, that the YWCA has long been committed to women and girls leading change in social justice and racial justice, gender equity, and a world without violence or war. So in some sense, this is an organization that's long been committed to just this type of work. The other thing that Gaye shared when she visited the University of St. Thomas in February was that approximately 16,000 Minnesota kids will experience homelessness. Those are numbers she said at that time that keep her awake at night. It's estimated that not providing adequate housing for today's workforce could cost us $215 million annually in job growth and productivity. That was pre-COVID-19. So imagine the space that we're in right now. Last but not least, and in direct conversation with Robert Kennedy, Gaye shared on that afternoon, when you understand someone else's different life experience and challenges they faced, you often find ways to consensus or figure out how we're going to keep moving forward. And that's what we'd like to do today in the context of this discussion. So to begin, we have to ask the question how we got here. And I go back to this famous cover of Time magazine from August of 1973. In fact, August 13th, so we're very close to the anniversary of this. And it was Governor Wendell Anderson gracing the cover of Time magazine and celebrating or affirming what was the good life in Minnesota. And the article talked about how, despite the social, economic, and political turmoil engendered by Watergate, high inflation in that moment, the lingering conflict in Vietnam, Minnesota was a state that was thriving, and that engendered a great deal of optimism. But the question for us is that Time magazine cover failed to represent that moment of celebration and optimism was not shared across the state by all peoples. Certainly Native Americans and African Americans experienced that moment very differently. And when we talk about that in the context of the recent murder of George Floyd, it's important for us to understand the historic context and how we got here and how those gains have not been general across communities. Having said that, there's a complexity to the housing question and to homelessness that we want to get at. And we want to do that by challenging or focusing on 4 persistent and pernicious myths about homelessness. The first one is that homelessness is a permanent problem and that we can never solve it, that we will never solve it. The second is that homelessness is not a housing problem, it's only a jobs problem. And the reason that this is significant is because homeless people simply don't want to work, and that contributes to this crisis. Third is the idea that all homeless people are mentally ill or addicts. And so therefore, that's the nucleus of the problem. And the last is that housing assistance causes more families to enter homeless shelters. And so that helps to perpetuate the problem. All of these myths are problematic in and of themselves, and we want to talk about them briefly. Let's begin with the first one, that homelessness is a permanent problem that we can never solve. Well, in fact, if you look at the graphic that we have here, from 2016, 2017, and we just look at these issues that are identified as reasons for people losing their housing. Number 1, unemployment or financial reasons. Number 2, conflicts with family or household. Number 3, problematic alcohol or drug use. Breakup, divorce or separation, mental health issues, no friends or family available, eviction or foreclosure. I want to point out, as you go down this list and you see those percentages fall, each one of these issues are addressable issues for which we could come up with interventions that would root out the issue of homelessness. In fact, if we attack homelessness by its parts, we can recognize very easily that this is a challenge that we could tackle if we're creative in thinking about a holistic approach in a way that the YWCA does to these types of issues. Having said that, I also want to be clear that racism is a significant factor in our conversations about residential segregation and about homelessness and housing insecurity in the United States. And we want to understand that it was not an accident how we got here. Housing segregation in Minnesota, as elsewhere, was deliberate. And I want to show you a very brief video, about 6 minutes, from the Jim Crow of the North that will cover that, and we'll move on with our presentation. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to show that to you, but what it would have documented was the introduction in Minnesota of redlining as a practice that was used to determine where communities of color or where people of color could live in the Twin Cities. It was a national issue that was introduced by the National Housing Act of 1934. And the fact that as a result of that, you had the HOLC, which created designations for neighborhoods that ultimately perpetuated redlining, which contributed to what I like to call the 6 degrees of segregation. Once you establish residential segregation, then you see segregation in other areas, segregation in access to places of public accommodation, segregation in education, unemployment and unfair labor practices, discriminatory voting practices, and ultimately Jim Crow justice. If we think, for example, about the George Floyd murder in some sense, you can see in the way in which all of these issues pivot around the issues that contributed to that consequence in Minneapolis. It's also important to note that when we go back to these pernicious myths, all of those are solvable, or at least issues that you could tackle in a strategic way. So this is not a permanent problem. It is a solvable problem, but it's one which would require us to think about how to deal with those historic injustices, including redlining, and how to rectify the inequality that they created. In addition, we have to deal with this myth that the homeless aren't working hard enough. And the fact of the matter is that in and of itself is part of a racialized narrative about inequality in America that blames the victims for historic injustice and systemic racism. This idea that all African Americans or Black and brown people need to do, all Native Americans need to do, is to pull themselves up by their bootstraps without recognizing, again, issues of housing and how they're related to healthcare, schooling, hunger, inequality. The reason that we have city councils across the country declaring racism a public health crisis is a good example of the way in which these issues are inextricably tied. And we have to understand that if we're going to think about not only addressing these myths, but tackling the housing issue. Having said that, we also want to take a look at the data. So here, it's very clear in terms of the top 3 causes of family homelessness, here they are: poverty, unemployment, and lack of affordable housing. So it's not this idea that most people who are homeless are addicts or mentally disturbed, that they don't work hard enough. These are in many cases structural issues, which again can be addressed. And we can talk about the ways in which the YWCA St. Paul is already doing that, and the ways in which we can work toward solutions that move us more in the direction of addressing these inequalities. The other pernicious myth we want to talk about is the idea that housing assistance causes more families to enter homeless shelters. And when we look at it, at the data again, and this is something that you see in the Wilder study, Under One Roof, while 10,233 Minnesotans were counted as experiencing homelessness in 2018, 11,371 if you add in American Indians, Wilder research estimates that 19,600 people in Minnesota were estimated to experience homelessness on any given night. As Gaye pointed out, that difference is big enough that it should be pointed out. This is why, in the very beginning, and as I shared when she addressed the community at the University of St. Thomas, it was important for her to note that this is what we should lose sleep over. And again, this is a very conquerable issue. Anything that you want to add there, Gaye?
No.
Great.
I think you're hitting on all the points.
If you can look at the graphic on the right then and see the way that those numbers flesh out, it's clear that there are solutions to the barriers to housing which we can conquer, but we also want to recognize in those barriers credit scores, racism, low wages, school debt, mental health, citizenship status, lack of knowledge, and felonies, literally the roots of those 6 degrees of segregation that I talked about. And if you looked at the proposed solutions, again, they deal with all of the roots of those problems. They don't focus on housing solely, because housing in some sense, or homelessness, is a symptom of a much larger disease. Having said that, if we look at some of the other data and talk about minorities in homelessness, according to the National Alliance to End Homelessness, most minority groups in the United States experience homelessness at a rate or at higher rates than whites, and therefore make up a disproportionate share of the homeless population. While African Americans only constitute 13% of the general population, they represent more than 40% of the homeless population. Similar statistics can be found for American Indians, Alaska Natives, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. So we can see that this is an issue that impacts Black and Brown communities, and we have to tackle those underlying issues as well. Having said that, again, if we look at the data and in terms of how people of color experience homelessness, it is very clear when you look at those numbers why this is an issue that has to be tied to the way that we deal with systemic racism and racial injustice in the United States. Now, again, if we go back to this idea about the top causes of homelessness, poverty, unemployment, lack of affordable housing, and then we look at these other dynamics that influence this conversation and inform this conversation, it's very clear that if we think about interventions that are rooted toward dealing with some of these contributing factors, we might be able to make a significant dent in the larger problem of the lack of affordable housing and access to housing for these communities. So a couple of important considerations before we let you go into your breakout groups. And Gaye, please, if are there any of these that you want to comment on, please jump in. But number one, there was a considerable increase in the number of people not staying in a formal shelter, 62% between 2015 and 2018. So consider the significance of that and why that's important. This points to the shortage of shelter space and services to help stabilize people in crisis. Shelters are at capacity and there's no available affordable housing. Now note, those numbers are from 2015 to 2018. We now have to view this in the context of the crisis that is the response to COVID-19 and how that has also disproportionately impacted the communities of color. And here in Minnesota, how that also speaks to access to healthcare, affordable healthcare, food deserts, and a host of other related issues that then make this a crisis on a much larger scale. Since 2015, there's been a 25% increase in older adults, 55 plus, experiencing homelessness. This growth is substantially faster than other adults in Minnesota overall. When we consider that older adults are going to be more vulnerable, and I want you to think back to some of those barriers and obstacles that were highlighted in the Wilder graphic. The fact that when you don't have a community structure, when you don't have a support system, that can exacerbate these issues and in some sense make these populations more vulnerable. those are important considerations as well. Last but not least, the main reason adults said they had difficulty renting an apartment or getting a house was because there was no housing they could afford. Now, this is important. So in some sense, there's housing scarcity, but there's also the issue of housing affordability. The median income of adults experiencing homelessness was $550. A one-bedroom apartment in the Twin Cities averages $864 per month and $576 in Greater Minnesota. So we can see that those individuals aren't even earning enough to afford that basic one bedroom. And we are talking in many cases about families with children and how do you deal with those issues? Again, things that the YWCA addresses, but we have to start thinking as a community how we tackle these issues. Part and parcel of this, half of homeless adults are on waiting lists for subsidized housing. And the average wait time is almost a year, more than a year in some cases. That's unacceptable. These are things that we can do better at. These are conquerable issues. Some other considerations for St. Paul in particular. In St. Paul, the majority of city dwellers are now renters. Another city where rents have been climbing and vacancy rates have been falling. 75% of those renters pay more than they should. More than 30% of their income goes towards rent. We all know what this means in terms of how that translates into meeting the other needs of the family, including healthcare, transportation, education. And so this in some sense becomes a debilitating experience that in many ways jeopardizes the stability of the family as a whole. Part and parcel of that is that children experience homelessness children experiencing homelessness face added barriers because homelessness can have a significant impact on a child's health, educational achievement, behavior, sense of safety, and overall development. Gaye notes it's estimated that not providing adequate housing stock in the metro for today's workforce could cost $215 million annually in job growth and productivity. So that speaks to the larger issue of how this impacts the community as a whole. This is not just an issue that is isolated in communities of color. This is an issue that impacts the entire community as a whole. And that's why we have to think about creative ways to conquer it. So the question is, how is the YWCA doing the work? And I love what Gaye shared with the St. Thomas community when she spoke to us back in February. And she offered the proverb of sticks in a bundle are unbreakable. What she shared on that day was, we believe this concept reflects the power of caring communities, the greater strength and impact of working together. The services we offer strengthen each person who comes through our doors. I want to stop there because this is the concept of cura personalis, care for the whole person. We're not just trying to treat the symptom, which is homelessness, but think about the other ways that those other issues that we talked about that inform this: low wages, lack of access to transportation, lack of access to adequate health care, an inability or the denial of being able to access social services, citizenship barriers, all influence that. And Gaye concluded, the true strength comes from the broader community of empowered individuals and families that we are building. Because again, it's not just about the individual, it's about building up the family. Where we wind up then is this wonderful graphic that shows some of the ways or some of the effective interventions that are currently being used to tackle the issue of housing across the nation. And I want to point out, as you're looking at this list, that many of these map to the programs that the YWCA St. Paul is currently pursuing to get a bunch of high level. So at the top, assistance getting housing, 80% as an effective intervention. Transportation services, 66%, assistance with public benefits, available job opportunities, job training and education. If I were to just stop there, these are some of the signature programs of the YWCA St. Paul, and those programs are having a real impact on the families that are benefiting from those services. The challenge is that we have to expand those services in ways that bring a greater number of people who are experiencing homelessness to be able to benefit. You look at some of these others in terms of physical health treatment. You think about the fitness center. You think about the mindful movement pilot program, staying in a specific community and investing in that community, and in thinking about a range of other services. This is the work to move forward to tackle homelessness as a structural problem informed by racism. So if we look at it in this concept and we move into our breakout groups and we kind of think about these issues large writ, I think it's important to highlight two things. I love this picture on the left. We don't need coins, we need change. If we go back to Robert Kennedy, if we put Robert Kennedy in conversation with Gaye Adams Massey, what we come up with is a formula that says that we should recognize in the tragedy of this moment, tremendous opportunity. It is true we're fighting two pandemics, racism and COVID-19, but it's also an opportunity for us to recognize in the challenges posed by both of those crises, both of those pandemics, an opportunity to focus on and to deal with the barriers created by racism that inform our housing crisis and housing instability and insecurity in the Twin Cities and beyond. What we'd like for you to do as we send you into your breakout sessions is to reflect on some of this history, some of this data, and then work with the facilitators to think through ways that strategically we might augment that work and continue that work. And I will turn it back over to Gaye at this point.
Thank you so much, Yohuru. That was fantastic. We're going to go straight to our breakout rooms so that you will have a chance to, in smaller groups, have conversation facilitated by our YW staff. And then after a bit of time, we'll bring you back and we'll share some of the best thinking from each of those groups. So I'm going to ask that the breakout rooms be established right now. Welcome back. I hope you had really good conversation. I know it wasn't much time, but I'm hoping you made some progress in the conversation, and I'd love to hear from each of the groups. So let's start with Jamila and Eileen. Can we get a short report out on what your group talked about?
Yeah, absolutely. We felt that the whole picture of homelessness is not seen, and this is a very immediate problem. There's complications with landlords and high fees, more pressures on families with the loss of the $600, COVID, evictions coming, and affordable housing is a misnomer. And there's a cycle of engineered poverty. We thought some solutions were to focus on the whole family, that we need to make change at the local, state, and national levels, redefine what qualifies as affordable housing, band together with the community for a push for change, and criminalization of homelessness, link to the conversation to other issues because this isn't standalone, and look at examples of success. We had a great group.
Wow, really good. Okay, the pressure's on for the rest of you. That's really good. Jessica and Rakisha?
Hey, so in our group, a couple of people had said that the lack of affordable housing, wondering why all of the new apartment buildings are going up in the neighborhoods and how the community can make it be able and open to be more affordable housing for our communities, and that there's not enough affordable housing units being built with enough bedrooms for our families, meaning basically saying that it might be affordable, but this family of 5 can only afford a 2-bedroom that this housing building is offering. So making sure that each building has enough units for our families that we serve. Some other things that we talked about is the challenging that the developers on how many affordable housing units will they have for each building that they put up. So one of our guests had spoke about the community having all these new apartment buildings in the neighborhood, but how many of them are open for our families to be affordable for them. And then some of the solutions was to start building in a lot of the vacant buildings that we see around our community, putting some more money into them instead of having to build them up from scratch. Needing to find grants to repair already abandoned buildings, that more of the community, people in the community can come to the community outings and fight more for affordable housing. What else? There's not enough shelter space. A lot of us don't know that there are families that are doubling up in the shelters or just in cars or whatnot. But having enough shelter space for the families out that are homeless right now that can't afford the housing that's out here. Another thing that someone has spoke about that was that some communities are better than others in supporting the homeless population, such as like Egan compared to St. Paul, or just different cities, and understanding that you might have to go out to another community and they might give you better support than St. Paul, but just trying to bring it all in one, and so that it can be all affordable and open for every city that we are in.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Rakisha. Zach and Stacy? You need to unmute.
We talked about sharing perspective, just reminding how when we make progress, how that can go also away so quickly. And then the toll that can take on us as service providers. We discussed how shocking it was that 50% of the homeless are under 18. So really looking at taking the 2-generation approach. There was a comment or a question, why fathers have such a difficult time getting into shelter with their children. Also looking at how difficult it is for 2-parent families to get into shelter. One comment was about looking at, the continued criteria for rent and the disparities, how disparities are perpetuated through that. And then also looking at, homelessness doesn't only mean sleeping on the streets, and then really tying that into also how we look at missed opportunities in the housing assessment and how that some people can fall short of access to various programs that they could get into.
Thank you. Thank you, Zach. Lashante and Kateri for our final group.
Yeah, we have, let's see, looking back at my notes, that a particular type of redlining could still be happening by building expensive apartments in areas that don't necessarily have the wages to support that. And that's pushing people out as a result. Building luxury apartments without luxury salaries to go with those. And then also homeless stigma, that more homelessness equals greater need for more shelters, and how complex, and then with that going into the complexities of homelessness and understanding the whole, the issues that surround it and make one person or one family homeless is not definitive. Many factors go into that. So homelessness doesn't necessarily mean people are staying in shelters. It could mean somebody is staying on somebody's couch. Whole families could be sharing, you could have multiple families sharing a home. And so really just understanding that we may be interacting also with people who are experiencing homelessness, and we may not know about it just because they don't fit into that stigma. And then we also have that homelessness is also expensive. It's expensive. It's taxing on resources. It's taxing on individuals. And so to combat that, kind of widening the understanding for everyone is really going to be saving everyone in the long run. We also talked a little bit about the complexities of solutions. Somebody brought up that private investors that are building these luxury apartments are not necessarily going to work with local governments or local organizations because they don't find it feasible to create space for affordable housing. But then to that end, we also for some of our solutions said that we need to put greater pressure on our local governments to really put guidelines in place to help even, private investors kind of adhere to local government guidelines to push forward for affordable housing. And then also demand better wages, better living wages.
Thank you. Those are such good comments. And, I can't help but think when I listen to some of those comments, back in the 70s, we did not have the same challenges around affordable housing. The federal government was really invested in building low-income and affordable housing. But in the 80s, we saw a gradual defunding of building projects and a move more toward support through vouchers for families to take advantage of existing housing stock. And there isn't enough. It's a huge issue, and local governments are now struggling to find ways to address it. Thank you to all of you for some really good input and insight in these conversations. Yohuru, I'd like to welcome you, Nikki, Dina. Any thoughts on what you heard?
Dina, Nikki, do you want to go first?
Where's Dina? Dina? I don't see her on here.
I don't see it.
Okay.
But I can jump in. I mean, I think definitely, our work is cut out for us, for sure. I think just on the heels of John Lewis's passing, all I could think about is really, it's about getting into good trouble when it comes to all of the issues that we're facing. And just how do we do that? I guess, so for me personally and professionally, it's how do I apply that good trouble to housing, to economics, to employment, to education. So I think that's the challenge for all of us, is how is having the courage to do that.
And I think too, seeing how interconnected, as Yohuru said earlier, how interconnected these issues are. And, having more housing stock that's affordable will be a big part of the solution, but not the totality of it, because so many things are linked.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was a really powerful piece in your presentation, Yohuru, that we have to think about those 6 degrees you were talking about as we try to tackle these issues.
And something that I love about the YWCA, which is the concept of wraparound services. So ultimately, people can't be engaged, particularly women who are in a vulnerable position if they're worried about their children. So we need childcare to be a part of that conversation. We need healthy outcomes to be a part of that conversation. So thinking holistically about families. I love that Nikki mentioned in the comments the vilification of men in this conversation, which is that goes back to the turn of the century in the way that we thought about this, and that ultimately hurts families. Gaye was talking about the 1960s and 1970s, the legacy of the Moynihan Report and the mythology around the breakdown of the Black family. But ultimately, this is a moment of reimagination. And one of the great things about the work that the YWCA does is that it takes the historical, it weds it to the contemporary, and it thinks broadly about what reimagination can look like if we're not wedded to convention. I love that you mentioned John Lewis, Nikki, because one of the things that was so great about him is he was never wedded to convention. It was always about innovating around good trouble. And I think there's tremendous impact we can have in the area of housing, of thinking about what the YW has done successfully in past years. And then in this moment where there's this tremendous amount of urgency around these issues, really thinking about how we can move this work forward by just being in a moment of understanding that we don't get these opportunities often. So we really need to take advantage of what's in front of us.
Mm-hmm.
I saw a hand raised earlier. Is there still a question from the group, from the person who raised her hand? Thanks. I'm not seeing anything.
I don't see any hand raised in the chat.
Okay. Okay. I just wanted to acknowledge that if there was still a question. Well, I really want to thank you all for joining us today. As Yohuru mentioned earlier, we're really in a historic time, and I'm grateful that there's so many people in our community who are really grappling with how they can contribute to building a more just and equitable society, because that's really what this is about. You've heard a little bit about YWCA St. Paul, our mission to eliminate racism, empower women. And, one of the ways we do that is through facilitating conversations like this that help empower people to understand issues so they can learn how to make change in their communities. And the other way we do is to work on these issues, usually problems with big racial disparities like homelessness. So I hope you found today's event inspiring and that it's sparked a renewed commitment to the fight against racism and for affordable housing for everyone, one rooftop at a time. And I hope you support this important work that's going on across our community at YWCA St. Paul and in other organizations to tackle homelessness and the shortage of affordable housing. Heartfelt thanks to you, Yohuru, and sincere thanks to each of you for attending. It's really been an honor to spend some time with you this afternoon. If you'd like to continue on this journey of learning and action, please join us for future conversations. Next month's topic will focus on voting. To learn more, you can visit our website for information on upcoming events. Thank you all, and good night.
Good night. Gaye, a question?
I have a question.
Yes.
I'm sorry.
Will the PowerPoint, Yohuru, be sent with the recording? I see you shaking your head. Thank you.
Yes. Yes.
So my question is, what are you guys gonna do with this information and what's gonna be next, like from this discussion?
Yeah, we're gonna take the ideas that we've got.
Yes, I'll have the same question.
I'm sorry. We want to take the ideas that came from the group. So we're always looking for input for our programs, but we also participate in organizations in the community that are working on these issues. So we want to share. I'm hearing a lot of feedback. I'm sorry. I'm not sure if you guys are hearing. We'll
Go ahead, Gaye.
Go ahead, Gaye.
I'm sorry. I lost my train of thought. It's too much distraction. We're going to take this input. We use input we get to inform our own work, but also try to share it with other advocates working on issues of homelessness and housing in the community. We also invite those of you who have an interest in digging in on this issue, if you're interested in volunteering for any of our programs that serve homeless families or individuals, we would love to have your engagement with us on that. So we do welcome you in that way. So are there any other questions before we close up? We've met our time and we're trying to keep to that time to respect everyone's time commitments this evening.
Okay, my last question is, will somebody be providing us with the information if we wanted to sign up to volunteer? How do we get that information?
There's great information on our website. I'd really encourage you to go to our website. There's information about all our programs, about this our racial justice work, about opportunities for volunteering. And we'd really be delighted to have you take a look there and get in touch with us if you'd like to work with us. And that invitation is for everybody participating tonight. So thanks again for joining us. We appreciate it, appreciate all of you, and we hope to see you at our next conversation on voting. Take care, everybody. Bye now.